The Galactic Academy was unlike any other institution in the known universe. Spanning multiple planets and orbiting massive stars, it was a place where the brightest minds, the strongest warriors, and the most influential leaders came to learn. The Academy's towering spires and sprawling campuses were filled with alien species from every corner of the galaxy, each one more advanced, more evolved, and more capable than the last. For centuries, it had been a symbol of the pinnacle of intellectual achievement and physical prowess. Its graduates went on to shape the fates of entire worlds, their names etched in the annals of history as paragons of their respective civilizations. And then there was him, Jackson Steele, a human outsider, the first of his kind to ever set foot on the Academy's sacred grounds. No one expected much from him. Humans were seen as a primitive species, reckless, emotional, and far too unpredictable to be taken seriously. They had only begun to explore the stars, and their reputation, if anything, had been earned through their violent history and their tendency to fight first and think later. To many of the more sophisticated beings in the galaxy, humanity was little more than a passing curiosity, a species that might one day amount to something, but was currently no more significant than the countless other upstart races scattered across the stars. How many lives had our ancestors told us about the greatness of our world, about the virtue of humanity? Jackson wasn't worried about what others thought of him. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, and he had learned to use it to his advantage. From a young age, he had been trained in the arts of survival. He had learned how to fight, how to think on his feet, and how to exploit the weaknesses of others. In his world, it wasn't the most intelligent or the most gifted who survived. It was the ones who could adapt, the ones who could outlast their enemies, and the ones who could turn the tables when the odds were stacked against them. Jackson had done that his entire life. Now he was about to do it on a much larger stage. The moment he set foot on the Academy grounds, a ripple of unease passed through the crowd of students gathered in the central courtyard. He could feel their eyes on him, disdain, curiosity, and even a hint of mockery. It was no surprise. After all, a human had no place in such a prestigious institution. The other species here were far more advanced, more refined. They had centuries of knowledge and history on their side. What could one human possibly bring to the table? The answer, as it turned out, was something none of them had anticipated. Jackson stood tall, his posture perfect, exuding an air of confidence that made even the most seasoned members of the Academy staff hesitate. He wore a sleek silver suit, human-made, but with modifications that allowed him to blend in with the rest of the students. His dark hair was cropped short, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him, calculating, assessing, and perhaps even daring the Academy itself to challenge him. He didn't flinch when the security personnel approached him, their eyes filled with suspicion. It was a formality, of course, but Jackson was no fool. He knew the risks. As the first human to be allowed into the Academy, he was a test case. If he succeeded, it would open doors for others. If he failed, it would confirm the doubts many had about his species' ability to contribute meaningfully to the galaxy's elite circles. The courtyard was a vast open space, surrounded by towering columns and ornate statues that depicted the great heroes and scholars of the galaxy. It was beautiful, but Jackson was hardly impressed. His mind was focused on the task at hand, to prove that he belonged, to show these aliens that a human could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best of them. As he walked through the courtyard, the whispers of the other students followed him, a murmur of disbelief and mockery. "A human?" one of them said. "What is he doing here?" "He doesn't belong," another voice replied. "We should have never let him in." Jackson didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had heard those voices before. He had heard them his entire life. But the thing about being underestimated was that it gave you an advantage. No one ever saw you coming. No one expected you to succeed. And when you did, when you proved them wrong, it was that much sweeter. The first test came within days of his arrival. Every student at the academy had to pass the trial of strength, a grueling challenge that tested not just physical endurance, but mental fortitude as well. The trial was designed to push students to their absolute limits, to force them to confront their greatest fears and weaknesses in a controlled environment. It was said that no one had ever failed the trial of strength, and that its tests were impossible to pass without first mastering the fundamentals of combat, strategy, and survival. Jackson had no doubt in his mind that he could succeed. His body was conditioned for battle and his mind was sharper than most. He had been trained in the most brutal environments on Earth, places where only the strongest survived. To him, the trial of strength seemed like little more than an inconvenience. The moment the trial began, Jackson was thrust into a simulated wilderness, a dense jungle teeming with dangerous creatures that seemed to appear from thin air. The ground was slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the scent of alien plants and the sounds of unseen predators lurking just out of sight. It was a test of survival, pure and simple. But survival was Jackson's specialty. As the first of the creatures appeared, an enormous, armored beast with razor-sharp teeth, Jackson didn't hesitate. With a fluid motion, he grabbed the nearest branch and swung it at the creature with all his strength. The beast howled as the branch shattered against its hide, but Jackson was already on the move. He darted behind a tree, using the dense foliage to his advantage as he surveyed the creature's movements. It lunged at him, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from his face. But Jackson had anticipated the move. He dove to the side, rolling onto the ground and coming up in a crouch. He'd learned early on that the key to survival was not just strength, but speed and precision. The beast circled him, and Jackson waited for the perfect moment. As the creature lunged once more, Jackson planted his feet and sprang forward, driving his elbow into its side with all his might. The impact sent the creature crashing to the ground, dazed and disoriented. Jackson didn't waste a second. He grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it at the beast's head, knocking it out cold. It was only the beginning. More creatures emerged, and Jackson dispatched them one by one with ease. But as the trial continued, it became clear that the true test wasn't the creatures, it was the other students. The academy wasn't just testing his survival skills, it was testing his ability to compete against the galaxy's finest. One by one, the students began to close in on him. They were fast, well-trained, and armed with advanced weapons. A group of 4 soldiers surrounded Jackson, their blasters aimed at him. They were all from different species, each one stronger and faster than the average human. But Jackson wasn't intimidated. He knew how to fight, how to think strategically, and how to turn the tables on his opponents. The first soldier moved in, striking with precision and speed, but Jackson anticipated the move and sidestepped, grabbing the soldier's arm and twisting it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The second soldier fired, but Jackson ducked, narrowly avoiding the blast. He rolled forward, landing in a crouch, and knocking the soldier's legs out from under him. The remaining 2 soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. They had seen their comrades fall with ease, and they didn't know what to expect from the human. But Jackson's expression remained cold, calculating. He was in complete control. "Is this really the best you've got?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but before they could react, Jackson lunged forward, taking down the next 2 in a series of swift, brutal movements. It was over in moments. As the trial came to a close, Jackson stood alone in the center of the arena, panting but unharmed. His opponents lay scattered around him, either unconscious or incapacitated. He had passed the trial of strength, not just with skill, but with a display of raw power and strategy that no one had expected from a human. The Academy's judges, high-ranking officials from various races, watched from the sidelines, their expressions unreadable. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, one of the judges spoke. "Of course. Well done, human. he said, his voice heavy with a mix of respect and disbelief. "You have passed the trial of strength." But it wasn't just the judges who were impressed. Word of Jackson's victory spread quickly through the academy. Students whispered in awe of his prowess, and some even began to fear him. The human outsider had done the impossible. He had not only survived the trial of strength, but he had defeated the best the academy had to offer. The whispers grew louder, more frequent. Jackson Steele wasn't just another student. He was something different, something they couldn't fully understand. He was a force to be reckoned with. And so the legend of the human outsider began. Weeks had passed since Jackson Steele's arrival at the Galactic Academy, and already the whispers surrounding him had taken on a life of their own. No longer was he the curious anomaly, the human outsider who had somehow managed to gain access to the hallowed halls of the academy. He was something else now. Something feared. Some said he was a genius. Others called him a monster. There were those who argued he had no place in the academy at all, that his very presence was an affront to everything the institution stood for. But whatever anyone thought of him, there was no denying one truth. Jackson had made an undeniable impact. The Academy's instructors, many of whom had decades, if not centuries of experience, had watched in awe as he effortlessly bested the greatest challenges their tests could throw at him. His mind, sharp and calculating, approached problems with an intensity few could match. And his combat prowess was beyond anything they had ever witnessed in a student. The trial of strength had only been the beginning. Jackson's ability to adapt to every situation, to learn on the fly, and to outthink even the most seasoned warriors had earned him the grudging respect of the Academy's elite students. But it also earned him their fear. It started with small things: underestimated glances, dismissive remarks, and the quiet plotting of a few students who decided that they should be the ones to put the human in his place. That, they quickly learned, was a mistake. One afternoon, as Jackson made his way to the next round of classes, he was met by a trio of students who had been waiting for him outside the training hall. They were from one of the more martial species, tall and powerful, their skin covered in metallic scales that shimmered under the bright lights. They had tried before to challenge him during the trial of strength, but Jackson had crushed them effortlessly. Now they were determined to get their revenge. "You've caused quite a stir around here, human," one of them said, his voice thick with a snarl. Jackson stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in the three of them. He didn't feel the need to speak. He knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't about honor or proving themselves. This was about something much simpler: pride. They couldn't stomach the idea of a human besting them, and they were determined to make him pay for it. "I didn't come here to make enemies," Jackson said coolly. "But if you're looking for a fight, I'm happy to oblige." The trio grinned, a flash of savage satisfaction crossing their faces. They were larger, stronger, and better equipped than Jackson, but there was something in his calm demeanor that made them pause. They had expected him to be intimidated, to hesitate, but Jackson didn't even flinch. The first of them lunged, swinging a massive fist toward Jackson's head. But the human was faster, his body moving with the fluid grace of a predator. He ducked under the punch, and before the other student could react, Jackson's leg snapped out, catching him in the side and sending him crashing to the ground. The second student was on him almost immediately, but Jackson anticipated the move, stepping aside just in time to let the student's momentum carry him forward. As the alien stumbled, Jackson moved in, striking with pinpoint accuracy. His elbow slammed into the back of the student's neck, knocking him unconscious in a single move. The third student, now alone, stood frozen for a moment. He was bigger than the others, his form towering over Jackson's, but he didn't seem quite as sure of himself. The arrogance in his eyes faltered for the briefest moment. "You should have stayed down," Jackson muttered. With a final burst of speed, he closed the distance between them, his fist landing in the student's gut before the alien could even react. The impact forced all the air out of his lungs, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap. Jackson stood over them, his chest heaving slightly, but otherwise unscathed. The fight had been over before it had even begun. He had done what he always did: adapted, outthought, and overpowered them. The silence that followed was deafening. Other students had gathered to watch the fight, and they now stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape. No one had expected Jackson to dispatch the 3 students so easily, and no one had expected him to do so without even breaking a sweat. By the next few days, whispers filled the academy's halls. The trio who had challenged Jackson had been humiliated in front of their peers, and rumors of his combat abilities spread like wildfire. Some began to question their own positions in the academy. If the human could defeat the strongest warriors they had, what did that say about their own abilities? It wasn't just in combat that Jackson excelled. The Academy's coursework, designed to test the brightest minds across the galaxy, was as demanding as any physical trial. Jackson's first day in the Advanced Studies program had left many of the professors skeptical. They didn't believe a human could match the mental prowess of their finest students, but they quickly learned just how wrong they were. One particular course, Galactic Engineering, was infamous for its difficulty. It was taught by Professor Valen, an alien of the Vorians, a race known for their meticulous approach to problem-solving. The professor had decades of experience and had never once encountered a student who could outpace his curriculum. He had expected Jackson to fall behind, to struggle with the complex theories and equations that made up the foundation of the class. Instead, Jackson had done something unexpected. He solved the first problem, a deep space propulsion equation, within hours of receiving the assignment. The rest of the class had spent days on it, but Jackson had completed it with the precision of a seasoned engineer, offering an approach that no one had ever considered. His solution, while unconventional, worked, better than any of the existing designs. When Jackson turned in his work, Professor Valen had been stunned. The solution was brilliant. It wasn't just a correct answer, it was revolutionary. The rest of the class had been left in awe, some even feeling a hint of jealousy. The human had shown them that their methods were outdated, that their thinking was too rigid, and it wasn't just a fluke. He did the same with other assignments, solving problems in medicine, in biochemistry, and even in intergalactic diplomacy. He was constantly thinking outside the box, and his ideas were nothing short of brilliant. The professors were forced to reassess their opinions of the human. Jackson wasn't just strong, he was intelligent, and his mind worked in ways that no one had anticipated. But not everyone was impressed. Some students, particularly those from more established and prestigious species, saw Jackson's rise to prominence as a threat. The older, more conservative factions of the Academy resented the idea that a human, no matter how talented, could come to dominate their institution. They had fought for centuries to preserve their place at the top, and the arrival of a newcomer, especially one from a species they considered inferior, made them uneasy. It was only a matter of time before a group of these students decided to take matters into their own hands. They approached Professor Valen, questioning Jackson's place in the Academy, hinting that perhaps he had gained favor through less than honorable means. They were subtle at first, but their intent was clear. They wanted him out. "Oh!" Professor Valen listened to their complaints, but he said nothing in response. He had seen what Jackson was capable of, and he knew that the human's talents were undeniable. But the pressure from his fellow professors and from the students grew. The Academy wasn't just a place for education, it was a place of power, and the balance of that power was beginning to shift. Jackson knew something was brewing. He could feel the tension in the air, a growing hostility that was starting to ripple through the halls. It wasn't enough for him to be the best in combat, the best in intellect. It seemed that in order to truly succeed in this place, he would have to fight not just for survival, but for his place at the table. The stakes were higher now. The galaxy's most powerful minds were all watching. The path ahead was no longer just about proving himself. It was about reshaping the Academy in his image, and perhaps even changing the course of history itself. The tension had reached a boiling point at the Galactic Academy. Jackson Steele had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but even he could sense that the stakes had escalated. The whispers had become louder, more insistent. The students who once doubted him now feared him, and those who had initially thought of him as an anomaly now viewed him as a threat. The Academy, once a place of prestige and exclusivity, had become a battleground, and Jackson had positioned himself at the center of it. The days leading up to the Academy's annual leadership trials were the most intense. Every year, the Academy selected a handful of students to participate in a series of tests designed to evaluate not just their intellect and combat skills, but their ability to lead and inspire. The trials were grueling. Physical endurance tests, strategic warfare simulations, and diplomatic challenges, all designed to push students to their limits. The winners were given the highest honors, a place at the top of the Academy's hierarchy, and the opportunity to shape the future of the galaxy. For the past few years, the trials had been dominated by students from the most prestigious species, an elite group that had held a monopoly on power and influence within the Academy. But this year things were different. Jackson Steele had made it clear that he wasn't just a student to be ignored. He was a force to be reckoned with. And for the first time in centuries, a human might actually win the leadership trials. So many times the delegation had refused to approve. It wasn't just his combat abilities or his intellect that had earned him the respect of many. It was his ability to think outside the box, to challenge the conventional wisdom that had governed the Academy for so long. He wasn't afraid to break the rules, to question authority, and to push boundaries in a way that others never dared. Some saw it as reckless, others saw it as genius. As the day of the trials arrived, the Academy's grand amphitheater was filled with students, instructors, and high-ranking officials from across the galaxy. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and anticipation. This year's trials would be unlike any before. Jackson was not just a participant, he was a symbol of change. And for many, that was both thrilling and terrifying. The first test was a series of combat simulations designed to test the participants' ability to fight in a variety of environments. Jackson had already demonstrated his prowess in the trial of strength, but this would be different. The simulations were far more complex, involving multiple combatants and varying terrains, where success depended not just on raw power, but on strategy and adaptability. The simulations began, and Jackson wasted no time. He was pitted against a team of 4 students, each one more experienced than he was in terms of combat training. They were fast, skilled, and ruthless. But Jackson had learned long ago that it wasn't enough to simply outfight an opponent. It was about understanding the terrain, the psychology of your enemies, and most importantly, knowing when to strike and when to retreat. The simulation began in a dense forest environment, where visibility was low and the terrain was treacherous. The other students immediately split up, each one taking a different path to flank Jackson. But he was ready. His eyes flicked to the map in his mind, noting the locations of the other combatants. He knew they would try to surround him to catch him off guard, but he wasn't going to make it that easy. He moved swiftly through the trees, careful to stay hidden while keeping an eye on his surroundings. His first move came when one of the students, a hulking alien with thick, muscular limbs, emerged from behind a tree. Jackson didn't hesitate. He lunged, knocking the student to the ground with a well-placed kick to the chest. The alien struggled, but Jackson quickly disarmed him, tossing his weapon aside before delivering a swift strike to his opponent's head, rendering him unconscious. The next opponent, a nimble Zoltar from the high-gravity planet of Thavon, attempted to approach from the rear. But Jackson had already predicted the move. He spun on his heel, launching himself into the air, grabbing a low-hanging branch and using it as leverage to launch a devastating kick that sent the Zoltar crashing into the ground. Before the Zoltar could recover, Jackson was on top of him, pinning him to the ground and locking him in a hold that left no room for escape. As the final two students closed in on him, Jackson recognized the familiar pattern. They would work together, attempt to outsmart him with their numbers. But he was ready. He could feel the weight of their approach. Their coordinated movements meant to force him into a corner. Jackson didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, he feigned weakness, stumbling as if he had been caught off guard. The two students, eager to finish him off, rushed forward in unison. But that was exactly what Jackson had been waiting for. With lightning speed, he pivoted, his arm sweeping out to trip the first student, sending her crashing to the ground. As the second student lunged, Jackson grabbed a nearby stone and hurled it toward him, knocking the student off balance long enough to close the distance. A quick series of blows incapacitated the final opponent. The simulation ended, and Jackson stood alone in the center of the arena, the other students lying unconscious around him. The judges watched in stunned silence. The entire arena was still. For a moment, no one spoke. "Well," one of the judges finally said, breaking the silence, "that was unexpected." The other participants, while not injured, were clearly shaken. Jackson had dominated the simulation, not just through raw power, but through sheer tactical brilliance. And it was that combination of intellect and physical skill that set him apart from the rest. The judges had never seen anything like it. Indeed, others, who had rarely undergone such a training session before and rarely underwent it so rapidly, were standing around looking at themselves and their reactions. The judges had never seen anything like it. The second test of the leadership trials was a diplomatic challenge designed to evaluate the participants' ability to manage interstellar relations and broker peace between opposing factions. It was a test of strategy, patience, and negotiation skills, qualities that many of the Academy's elite students had honed for years. It was a test that seemed tailor-made for the established species who had spent centuries dealing with the complexities of galactic diplomacy. But Jackson didn't hesitate. He wasn't just going to play by the rules, he was going to rewrite them. The challenge involved a delicate situation between two powerful factions. The Zarath Empire, a militaristic race that valued strength above all else, and the Arathian Coalition, a group of pacifists who believed in dialogue and cooperation. The two factions had been on the brink of war for years, and the task at hand was to broker a peace deal that would satisfy both parties. The diplomats from both factions sat across from Jackson, their eyes filled with suspicion and distrust. The Zorath leader was a towering figure, his body covered in jagged armor plates, while the Arathian representative was a serene-looking alien with glowing blue skin and a calm demeanor. The tension in the room was palpable. Jackson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He cut straight to the heart of the issue, acknowledging the long-standing animosity between the two factions, but refusing to indulge in the usual diplomatic niceties. Instead, he proposed a bold solution, a shared resource that would benefit both sides, a massive mining colony on a distant planet that contained rare minerals needed by both the Zarath and the Arathians. The Arathian representative was immediately skeptical. "You're asking us to rely on the Zarath for something as precious as that?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Such small waders can handle the size rocks," said Debris. Jackson nodded calmly. "Yes," he said, "because both of you need it, and because neither of you can survive without it." The Zorath leader grunted in agreement, though clearly he wasn't pleased with the idea of cooperating with the Arathians. Jackson didn't back down. He made it clear that the alternative was mutual destruction, a war that would tear both factions apart. He reminded them that their power was rooted in their ability to adapt, to innovate, and that meant finding common ground, even if it was uncomfortable. For hours, Jackson played the factions against each other, pushing them toward compromise. He didn't shy away from making bold moves, offering incentives, and even threatening to pull support if they didn't reach a deal. By the time the session ended, both factions were on the verge of an agreement, though it was far from perfect. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a solution, and that, as Jackson had proven time and time again, was enough. When the results were announced, Jackson had passed the diplomatic test with flying colors, his ability to manage complex relationships and broker peace solidifying his reputation. The whispers had now turned into awe. He wasn't just a fighter, he wasn't just a genius, he was a leader. But there were still those who opposed him. The most powerful factions within the Academy were beginning to take notice. And as Jackson stood on the precipice of greatness, he realized that the true test was just beginning. He had already proven his worth in combat and diplomacy, but now he would have to fight for his place at the top. The final trial would be the ultimate test of his leadership, and the greatest challenge he had ever faced.